thank you all for joining us for this new Life and Health Talk. I'm Nadia Shambi, and it's my great pleasure to be your host for today's virtual event. Now, after almost 2 years of individual and collective struggle due to the pandemic, the importance of mental health has risen to awareness to the point of becoming part of everybody's everyday conversation. Is it a transient trend or a profound social change? That's the question. What is the reality also behind this new focus on mental health? Well, to help us better understand what's at stake, I'm joined today by 3 very special guests whose purpose involves directly or indirectly improving the population's mental health with the aim of transitioning to a so-called sustainable wellbeing society. It's a broad topic to explore, so we will be narrowing it down to the mental health of 3 specific groups today: the young, employees, and expats. So now let me introduce our international panel. Joining me first remotely from Duke University, North Carolina, is Dr. Jasmine Wiertz. Hello, Jasmine.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being with us. I'm in also very good company in the studio here in Paris. First, we have Professor Lode Gorderis from Leuven University in Belgium. Hello, Lode.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you for being with us. And last but not least, of course, is Thomas Wilkinson, who's CEO of AXA Global Healthcare in the UK. Hello, Thomas.
Hi, Nadia. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Now, Jasmine, let me start with you. You are a postdoctoral associate at Duke University, and you specialize in child development, particularly in how children who struggle with behavioral problems or are exposed to early adversity navigate through life. Your current research is focusing on young people's mental health during the transition to work. You've experienced across many countries, even continents, from Germany to the UK, New Zealand, as well as the US, where you are now. Considering that the younger generations obviously represent the future of society, your research is, of course, of utmost significance. So, Jasmine, tell us, how are they doing? Can you share some insights with us first?
Yes, thank you. Mental health is a really important topic in young people. When I say young people, I mean ages from infancy, so very early in life, to approximately age 18 years. And we know from research that about 1 in 4 of young people experiences a mental health problem. So that could be anxiety, depression, or ADHD. We also know that the majority of all mental health problems starts at a young age, before age 14 years. So even when we think about mental health in adults, a lot of these mental health problems that adults experience often started much earlier in life. Now, unfortunately, there has been an increase in mental health problems among young people in recent years. And that was already the case before the pandemic. So, for example, there has been an alarming rise of self-harm, especially among young teenage girls. And these types of self-harm behaviors are often expressions of underlying emotional problems. And this trend of increasing mental health problems appears to have been made much worse by the COVID pandemic. So COVID does not pose as much of a physical risk to young people, but unfortunately, young people appear to suffer psychologically from the effects of the pandemic. And this could be due to a variety of reasons. For example, from the social isolation that is associated with lockdowns and school closures, or from the economic hardship that many families have faced because of the pandemic. Now, unfortunately, we also know that the majority of young people with mental health problems does not get the support they need. For example, a recent 2020 report in the UK on the state of children's mental health services reports that children often face lengthy delays to access support, and they are often denied treatment because their problems are not considered severe enough. So this report came from the UK, but the same issue is present in other countries too. And this report was published in 2020, but it reported on the state of mental health care before the pandemic. So it was bad before the pandemic even started. And it's thought that it's been made even worse by the pandemic. So poor mental health in young people is an urgent public health crisis that we as a society and as researchers are grappling with. We really need young people to be healthy for their own well-being, but also for their families' well-being, and also for the well-being of society. So as you already said, the young people of today are the citizens, the parents, and the workers of tomorrow. And so we really need them to be well.
That's right. As the future citizens, workers, parents, we need them to have access to what they need to have a good mental health. Would you say there's still stigma attached to discussing this issue?
Yes, there certainly is still a lot of stigma surrounding mental health in all age groups. So in young people as well as in older people. And that is something that needs to change. So, for example, there is a persistent belief that people with mental health problems are violent and dangerous, even though it's actually pretty rare for people with mental health problems to engage in violent behavior. There's also a widespread belief that a person with mental health problems cannot recover from the illness, even though we now have very effective treatments available for mental health problems. So these types of perceptions and the stigma is widespread, unfortunately. And it can do real harm because it can mean that people with these problems are hesitant to seek help, excuse me, or talk about their experiences, or are feeling even worse about themselves than they already do. And this issue of stigma is also very relevant when we think about young people in the workplace. So young workers are in many ways a particularly vulnerable population. They often don't have the same protections, the stability and the standing in a workplace as older workers, and they're often still working hard to prove themselves. So they experience more pressure, but they have less support. And this combination can be really stressful. And we know that stress is an important factor for the development of mental health problems. We also know that there is a persistent stigma and belief that people with mental health problems cannot succeed at work. And so people might be worried about disclosing any mental health problems they might experience. And that might be, again, particularly the case for young people for the reasons I mentioned before. Now, the good news is that employers can address these issues and they can make mental health a priority in their organization. So they can capitalize on this current trend toward more acceptance and openness about mental health problems. So, for example, as you already mentioned in the introduction, there is a trend at the moment that there is more public discussion about mental health, perhaps because of the pandemic. There are also public figures who are openly discussing their mental health struggles, for example, Prince Harry in the UK. Or now in the US. And this will hopefully make young people more comfortable in discussing and also prioritizing mental health. I saw a really lovely initiative here in the US the other day about high schoolers who were advocating for a bill that would allow mental health days at school, where students can take a day of absence from school for mental health reasons. And this is something that employers can do as well. So, for example, making it clear company-wide that mental health issues and self-care are valid reasons for taking time off. And this better attention to mental health in the workplace can ultimately pay off for employers as well. So we know that better mental health can lead to better engagement, reduced absenteeism, and higher productivity long term. And again, this is particularly relevant for young people because they are at the start of their working lives.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Clearly, young people, young workers are facing their own set of problems and challenges in terms of mental health in the workplace. Now, as I mentioned, also with us today is another renowned researcher, Professor Lode Goderis. Lode, welcome. You're the CEO of Belgian Service for Prevention and Protection, IDEWE, and professor at the Centre for Environment and Health of the University of Leuven. Your current research aims at improving well-being and health through and at work. Considering the scene set there by Dr. Wirtz, it appears that young people's outlook regarding work or life in general differs strongly from that of previous generations. In your opinion, does this new worldview protect them from mental health issues, or might it in fact act as an additional risk of developing mental health issues?
I think it's both sides. To some extent, they are protected because they are digital natives. That means they have lived always with smartphone, with computers, so they learn to live with it, they learn to deal with it, and they can control it much better than in my generation, the Gen X, which we are digital immigrants. So we learn to work with it. And so that brings specific challenges. And the advantages is that they also make more use of the digital means. So that's their strength, I think. On the other hand, they are very pretty much linked to social networks, and so always posting positive things might also induce some, carry some risk with it, so that everybody surrounding them and the posts they see gives them the impression that everybody is happy and always feeling well. So I think that's a bit the challenge there. Another aspect which is important when we look at generations, it's also that the current generation, young people, they are more exploring, they are more aware of living a life, and for them work is a means to live their life. While I think if you look in the baby boomers, the Gen X, I think we were choosing for a job with the idea we stay our whole life within the job. I think now the flexibility young people have also protects them and also helps them to disconnect from work. So it's a bit both sides of the medals in that perspective.
That's a really interesting point. Just to give us all a bit of context, research shows that mental illness begins at a young age and can affect people throughout their lifetime, as we've heard already. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by the age of 14 and 75% by age 24. And by 2030, mental health issues, particularly depression, will be the leading cause of mortality and morbidity throughout the globe. Now, the problems linked to burnout have only recently come to light in our societies. Based on your research, how do companies deal with these problems today? As I understand it, Lotte, you work very much, and your work is focused on that particular subject.
Yeah, indeed. We try to study the impact of work on mental health. And I think there are also both sides of the medal, right? So work can contribute to our health and can play an important role even in the treatment of mental health disorders. And I think that remains largely unexplored within psychologists, psychiatricians. So I really think we need to think on how we can help people to participate in society and how we can help people to improve their mental health at the workplace and through working. But that requires, of course, adaptation of workplaces and also try to find a match between the competencies, the interests of people, and of course, what's necessary to perform the job as required by the employer. So it's finding that equilibrium between both, which is very, very important. And that can change throughout life. So I think that's very important. Another aspect is that if you look, and again, it's something we learned from the pandemic, that at work we get social interaction with our colleagues, and I think that's what we all missed, right? So, yeah, digital means helped us to be able to conversate with each other, but it was not the same. The small talk, feeling linked with people is very important, and if people work remotely from home, they always have the feeling they miss something. They miss the interaction with the colleagues, but also have the feeling they miss important information which can have a negative impact on their functioning, but also on their career. So I think what we learned from this pandemic is especially that work is important, that it contributes to our health and our mental health. And in fact, if things are not well arranged, that can lead to mental health issues like, for example, burnout.
Thank you very much, Lotte, for this new perspective. I also understand that people going through burnout are often advised to cut all link with their colleagues for a while, so it's an interesting balance to strike. I'd like to turn now to Thomas Wilkinson, who, like I said, is the CEO of AXA Global Health in the UK. Welcome again. Tell me, as the CEO of a company employing hundreds of employees, I'm sure you've been confronted with employees' mental health issues especially over the past year and a half, I should say. What are the main issues you've had to address, and what lessons or good practices could you share from that?
Okay, yeah, sure. And I think there's no doubt that the pandemic has really heightened society's awareness of mental health as a major topic, right, that needs much more consideration. And while I like to think that AXA Global Healthcare has a really caring, a really supportive culture, we did nonetheless, during especially the early stages of the pandemic, see somewhat of a deterioration in the mental health of our employees. And I think really if you were to talk to any of the providers of employee assistance programs, for example, they would tell you that the number of calls by employees into their centres shot up during the early stages of the pandemic. And I think there's an interesting point here, which is actually quite good, and that is that all of our employees, I would say all, but the vast majority have probably got a greater understanding now and appreciation of their own vulnerability to mental health as a topic, and I know that I have as well. And we have 10 different offices around the world, each in a different country, so each with different languages, different cultures, different rules, regulations, laws, and yet when we talk to our employees in those different places, the feedback, the frustrations, the challenges that they're facing in the context of mental health are all quite similar. So as Lode, as you were saying there, these are things like a lack of connectedness to their colleagues, to their managers, and vice versa. But also, they found using the virtual platforms that, of course, we're all now using, much more tiring to use than face-to-face means of interacting. And also, for those who were parents, who are parents, who had to homeschool, I can relate to that myself, I don't know if either of you can, that was almost the straw that broke the camel's back. And if you take that concoction of additional stress and you couple it with that extra sense of isolation, you've got a pretty powerful risk there. And so we weren't isolated from that as AXA Global Healthcare. But nonetheless, we did take a lot of steps to try to manage that as best we could, and I think we were pretty successful. We found that basically the stress were really peaked quite early on in the pandemic. It then improved, and then it stabilized. And I think that's because, one, we had an inclusive culture within the organization that was already there, but I think it was some of the things that we introduced, like, for example, we had a In This Together initiative, which sounds quite harmless and quite silly, and actually it was, but it was just trying to find ways of encouraging connectedness between all of us, and not trying to do it in a formal meeting setting, doing things like online yoga sessions, doing manager walk and talks, doing anything that any of our employees could come up with that would just find an excuse to connect as human beings, albeit remotely, but at least not necessarily on a work topic. So I think that really, really helped. Another thing that I would definitely recommend for any companies out there that are listening is to invest in mental health first aiders. So this is something that we invested in a number of years ago, long before the pandemic, and we've trained up a small number, but a critical mass positioned in the right locations who've been trained in mental health, and they're there and available for employees to talk to. Now, of course, that was still virtual during the pandemic, but it nonetheless helped. And then, of course, we've got the usual employee assistance programs that our employees had access to. And then I think that the step further that we've gone within AXA Global Healthcare, because it's a core part of our proposition to our clients, is that we also recently introduced an app-based platform where our employees and our customers can get access to doctors who can also then refer on immediately to master's qualified level psychologists. And that, it's a safety net, and ideally you actually don't want to get to that point necessarily, but it's important to have that safety net in place as well. So I think, things got worse, they then improved, and overall I'm pretty pleased, but a personal view from me is that I don't think we've yet seen the full fallout of the pandemic and the lockdown. I think there's a long tail of that, and that we'll be talking about new insights a year from now as well that we haven't yet quite recognized.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. We're going to that idea also of feeling more in control and having ways to get access to help. Can I cross back to you perhaps, Jasmine? Many young people with mental health issues have difficulties in finding a job. Are there specific strategies to integrate young people with mental health problems into the workplace?
Yes, absolutely. So as you said, we know that for young people with mental health problems, it can be a challenge to find and to hold down a job. And this can have very negative effects on their whole life trajectory. So while it is important to promote mental health among existing employees, there's also a real need to integrate young people with mental health problems into the workforce. And this can already begin during recruitment. For example, young people with mental health problems might have had academic or work interruptions, and this can hold them back when applying for jobs. Employers should also consider reasonable accommodations, for example, offering a more flexible work schedule, remote work. Of course, this has become much more acceptable during the pandemic. So in that way, the pandemic has offered some opportunities as well to change the way that we think about work schedules and presence at the workplace, for example. It is really important to create a supportive environment, for example, making sure employees have regular check-ins with their supervisors to talk about any problems they're having, training supervisors to identify emotional distress and implement strategies to assist employees who may be struggling. And then also providing specific resources. So especially in larger companies, for example, here in the US, there is the issue of providing insurance coverage for mental health problems. And there are also ways to set up wellness programs for employees. So for example, here at Duke University, where I'm based, we have something called a personal assistance service, which is an employee assistance program that includes licensed professionals who can offer assessment, short-term counseling, and referrals to help resolve personal work and family problems. So very similar to what Thomas just mentioned.
That's right, very similar. I'm turning to you again, Thomas, to pick your insurer's brain. We've just seen the long-term effects of mental health. What role can insurers have in improving people's mental health from a societal standpoint, do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not going to pretend that insurers are the silver bullet here that's going to address this, not at all. But I think we do have a part to play. I think we have a role to play, given that we have millions of customers around the world. And I think, going back to the point about society having recognized the major topic that is mental health, I think Jasmine talked about the taboo nature of it a short while ago. And I think the taboo, breaking down the taboo nature of it is something that insurers can help with, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But I think that what we as insurers have also recognized is that aside from mental health meaning that you're unfulfilled and with that unproductive, which has an economic cost attached to it in of itself, we've also recognized that mental health sooner or later often leads to physical problems as well. Problems with the lower back, problems with the stomach. It could even be something like facial paralysis, all linked to mental health disorder. And we've seen that with some of the referrals that we've been supporting our customers with. So what can we do about that as insurance companies? I think there's a couple of things that we can do, and we are doing. The first is we can try to help break down the taboo by opening up the conversation, encouraging the conversation, of which, this is a small part of today. But also we have been investing in research and publishing that research. So if anybody's interested in that, if they were to Google Mental Health Europe and AXA, they would find a report where that was done during the pandemic, which was quite interesting. So there's a lot of insights from that. But in addition to trying to raise the subject up, we can also invest a lot of money in developing prevention and early intervention tools and methods. And that's what we're doing. We've been doing that for a while, but we've accelerated the investment, I should say, in that during the pandemic. So the sorts of things that I'm talking about there are holistic platforms that are app-based, that our millions of customers can get access to, that will provide them from a range of services, from simple things like breathing exercises if they feel like they've got anxiety and having a panic attack, through to much more serious interventions like talking to a psychologist, as I've mentioned, and everything in between. So we can raise awareness and we can invest in those sorts of tools. And we're trying to do that, and I think this is key, we're trying to do that in a way that makes those services available at an affordable level and in a highly accessible way. And a couple of examples of that, we have a tool. It's an app-based holistic platform called Emma. We've deployed it across Asia, and as I say, it's supported by technologies such as AI that now allows you to just do things on your own, through to real human beings suitably qualified at the back end of it. And we've got 2 million people using that already. We have a similar platform in Europe called Angel, and we're going to continue to invest in that and roll it out. And again, it's about trying to support as many people as we possibly can as a global insurer. And I think that's perhaps small, but it's a way that we can help as one of many insurance companies. The other thing that I would like to say is that I think it's important that we in the private sector do take these steps, because governments, quite frankly, haven't got the money at the moment, and they're going to have even less going forwards. And yet, from the research that I've seen with LEK, for example, if there were 25% of people who were predisposed to depression before the pandemic, that's risen to about 51% during the pandemic. For people with anxiety, it was about 8% before the pandemic. It's about 23% during the pandemic. So we have to support society in that role. But, it's not all negative. I've talked about this heightened awareness of vulnerability that we all have now. I think that's a really positive thing. And I think that's starting to break down the taboo, the fact that we're all talking about this now, the fact that I'm comfortable to talk about this now. And I think the second thing is the fact that we are all somewhat comfortable to use these digital platforms and tools as a way of at an affordable cost of giving people access to these support services. I think those are two really, really positive things.
Absolutely agree. Thank you, Thomas. Well, certainly digital tools are key for mental health support and prevention. Almost 2 years into the pandemic now, online care usage has certainly become more common at all levels. Consumers continue to view telehealth as an important modality for their future care needs. By the same token, social ties are key to our mental health. You both mentioned that. My next question is for you, Lotte. What impact does digitalization have on burnout? And as we have an international audience, perhaps you could share figures in different parts of the world for us.
Yeah, I think there are two studies I would like to mention here. So there's a recent OECD study that indicated just what was Thomas saying, that anxiety and depression doubled during the pandemic. So that's clearly a sign that being restricted and not being able to move and live our life like we are used to really had a negative impact on our mental health. So that's certainly one aspect. The other study I would like to mention, and that I also largely contributed to, is a recent WHO ILO study in which we looked at the impact of long working hours on death and other health outcomes. And what we do see now is that, for example, for the period 2000-2016, that there 745,000 of deaths can be attributed with long working hours, which is more than the estimated attributed deaths caused by air pollution, for example. So this is massive. And what's even more important, that during this period, the impact of long working hours on those deaths is rising. So it's really an emerging risk. And I think these two figures are really indicating that we really need to do something. And just to give an idea about long working hours, we define that as normally longer working than 48 hours, but it's in the study on concerning deaths, it's more than 55 hours of work. So, and there we do see regional differences. For example, Southeast Asia, but also the Western Pacific, these numbers are much higher compared to Europe and Africa, for example, where other challenges are, for example, in terms of occupational injuries. So it's important to be aware of these regional differences, and also the culture, for example, on long working hours. We all know that working long in Japan, it's a culture, part of the working culture, and which is really causing a lot of issues on mental health, while in other societies, maybe the stigma, we are performing research in Morocco, for example, and there the stigma on mental health is much bigger than, for example, here in Europe. So each region has its challenges, its characteristics, and there are cultural differences that play a role at the workplace as well. And the last thing what I would like to mention is, if we talk about digital, I think the benefit of working remotely from home is that gave us some kind of autonomy, and in fact that protected us to some extent also from developing burnout. So it's also positive. It's a bit more challenging to find a balance between work and life. That's becomes evident. And what's, for me, one of the key figures that I always have in mind when talking about this is, actually we gain a lot of time. We do not have to commute anymore, so we probably win 1 hour and a half, 2 hours a day, because we do not have to commute from home to work and work to home.
So what do we do with that time?
But what do we do with it? And there, 40% indicates that they spend it on their primary job. So in fact, apparently workers perceive commuting time as working time. And instead of using that time to spend more time, maybe be with the kids, to cook, to have fun, to do your hobbies. Apparently this is something for 40%, let's say, to make it easy, half of the people are really struggling with that, and I think that's a challenge, especially for people working from home. And yeah, that's maybe the downside of digital connection, that at every moment of the day, we can be connected, and that's the challenge for all of us.
It's clearly a work in progress, but it's a new era, and we're slowly adapting as well. So hopefully it will move forward. And now, after having seen the subject of young people and workers, I'd like us now to come back to you, Thomas, on the case of expats. So people who've decided to leave their home country for a new adventure, perhaps. At the best of times, this actually isn't without risk, but the COVID context has certainly taken its toll on expats. Can you tell us more about this target group? What are AXA Global Healthcare's findings on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a huge topic. And as you say, it's already quite a risky scenario when somebody moves abroad, potentially to a country where they don't speak the language. They won't have friends, they won't have a support network, they don't understand the culture. I can remember being in Japan, staring at the shelves on the supermarket and genuinely having no idea what to take off the shelf, right? I mean, things like that can all add up. So it's already a challenging time. And actually, it's something that we've researched quite a lot. And again, we've produced a report. I won't go through the details of it now, but it's called Mind Health. So if you were to search World of Work, Mind Health, and AXA Global Healthcare, you'd find it. But perhaps some interesting context from that is that, pandemic aside, generally expatriates who come back, who return from wherever they've been, and they look back at their experience, in the research that we've done, about 46%, so roughly half, say that it contributed positively to their mental health and well-being. So I think that's quite interesting. 10% said that their mental health deteriorated, and this is them having come back and looking backwards. So that's reasonably serious. And then the rest were neutral. So read into that what you will. I think overall that means there's perhaps more to be gained from doing expatriation, but it isn't without its risks. We also found that typically the more expatriations you do, the more you enjoy them, the more you get out of them. It's like anything in life, the more you do, the better you get. But there are some biases there, because actually it tends to be more senior people that get offered expatriations, and better people typically get better support from management, from the package that they're provided with, both financially and in terms of the services around mental health, etc. So there's some nuances there to that. I think that if we think about COVID-19, clearly it has significantly amplified the risk that I've already talked about. If you already lacked a network, but you could slowly go out there and build one, you weren't able to do that during the pandemic. So that's been really tough. And actually 10 to 15%, we don't have the full data yet, because it's still emerging, but 10 to 15% of expatriates actually came back to their home country. And these, remember, weren't short-term international assignments. These were people who had perhaps been there already 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and were going to be out there for a significant period of time, and they've dropped it and they've come back to their home countries, and they won't be returning. So that's quite a significant impact. So that really brings me to the point that the best companies out there that have been supporting their employees, that at the end of the day they've sent out to another country, even though ultimately everybody should be a responsible adult in that decision making, they've nonetheless somewhat encouraged them to go out there. These employers need to take their duty of care and their responsibility really, really seriously. So the best companies out there won't only have employee assistance programs, but they'll have employee assistance programs that have both physical and virtual means of connecting. They will have access to virtual doctors who speak their own language, that have the social context that they're used to, and they will be able to give them the appropriate psychological support behind that as well. But really my view on this is that all of those things are wonderful, but what's more important is supporting employees with just good management, care and attention. I think, I can't remember if it was Jasmine or Lode who was talking about it, but I think it was Jasmine, that checking in with people on a regular basis, caring about the people that you are sending into an unfamiliar environment is really, really important, because we want to avoid the situation where you need to call on that safety net. So the best companies provide a really holistic approach to care for both physical and mental. And I think it's worth doing that, right? There's a business case. If we want to talk cold and economic, there's a business case to this, because we know just from the King's Fund research in the UK that unexplained items lead to cost of about £3 billion in the National Health Service in the UK. So effectively, mental health issues lead to physical issues, which costs a huge amount of money. And it's really too late if you're in an expatriation position, because once you're in that really vulnerable state, you're going to want to go home. So it's really important that employers take that seriously. Most do, but there's a patchwork out there, and there's more about that in our research. And I think that probably covers it off.
Yeah, thank you very much for that multifaceted picture of what it is to go through that expat experience. Living abroad clearly does contribute to a more fulfilling, although sometimes challenging life, doesn't it? Now, since the beginning of the crisis, companies have been announcing they would go on a fully remote working mode, then switching to hybrid, and then fully back to the office in some cases. All in all, many companies are still trying to sort of figure out what works best, as I was saying earlier, sort of a work in progress, while also including the needs and wants of employees and their experience. So now to look ahead, and with the knowledge we have on the importance of mental health, Loda, what do you think the workplace will look like in the future?
I think we will have different workplaces, and we will work where we perform best. So I'm a strong believer of activity-based workplaces. So if you want to do focused work where we need a lot of concentration, we probably are best at home. We do not have colleagues around us. We are not disturbed by telephones and etc. So that's probably the best place to do focused, concentrated work. While at the workplace there, that will be a place where we want to meet people, interact with people, discuss. And so I see that an evolution towards workplaces that will become a place where people gather, meet, and also creative processes also work better when you are surrounded in a new environment like here. So I think that might be a third option. If you need to think about new services, new products, you might want to bring your people not at the workplace, but maybe meet in a pub, in a bar, or maybe in the forest, depending on the kind of stimuli you need to generate new ideas. And I think that's one of the challenges at the moment for a lot of employers, because what you see now is that we all discovered the advantages and disadvantages of remotely working, but you see that most people want to work 2 to 3 days from home. So that becomes an objective for a lot of employees. And that might be a challenge because then the remote working doesn't become a means to perform best, but becomes an objective. And I think that's one of the challenges companies might have. To what extent can we talk and discuss with the employees about their needs, their expectancies, but also to see how we can create the best workplaces, including home, and I think that's one of the challenges that probably all companies are experiencing at the moment. But my advice there is, please think about the means you need to perform best, and that make people engaged and passionate about their job, which will be good ultimately for their mental health, rather than instrumentalizing workplaces and for example simply say, okay, 2 days a week, this is the standard we will apply, and everybody has a right on 2 days per week remotely working from home. I really think we need to adapt, be flexible, and listen to each other's expectancies on that perspective.
A challenging conversation to come then. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Such a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much to all three of you for having been with us today. And thank you for watching and tuning in. Now, as we've just heard, COVID-19 has raised awareness of mental health as an important issue, deeply affecting specific populations, notably young people and women, we were hearing also from Jasmine. No longer a stigmatized individual challenge, mental health has turned into a true long-term societal challenge that's impacting employers and other stakeholders directly. The transition to a well-being society, the role of the employer and manager is key, and a change of mindset is hugely important as there are still challenges ahead, as we've been hearing there from Loda. With that thought, though, it is time for me to wrap up our talk. Thank you again to our guests. Thank you for taking part.
Thank you.
And we hope you found this talk enlightening, and it will help you take care of yourself and others also. Thank you all, and goodbye.